Illicit drug use, if you measure it by annual prevalence, people who've consumed the drugs at least once in the year prior to the measurement, is confined to less than 5% of the adult population of the world. Less than 5%, approximately 200 million people. Tobacco is consumed by approximately 30% of the adult population of the world. Alcohol is consumed by approximately 50% of the adult population of the world.
Drug use that does not cause harm is of no consequence. And of course, this is a deep fault line that we're going to have to deal with politically and socially. There is a real difference between people who think that harm of drugs is the problem and those who think drug use is the problem. This is a phenomenon that's been mirrored before in, for example, control of sexually transmitted diseases. The line between those who want to do nothing in the way of harm reduction for AIDS that might encourage sex, and those who don't care about how much sex there is as long as there's no AIDS transmission. That's going to be a problem, but I think to go forward, we're going to have to see harm as the problem, not drug use.
There have been two consequences of the fact that the legislation for the last 30 years has tended to focus on supply control through police and justice responses. First of all, strategies to reduce demand and limit the problems of drug use have been easily lost sight of. The legislative emphasis can easily become and has become the emphasis in practice. And secondly, and related to that, the debate has increasingly been captured by the rhetoric of the war on crime.
When I spoke earlier of approximately 200 million people, or 5% of the adult population of the world using illicit drugs, if you just consider cannabis in this 5%, cannabis accounts for 4 of the 5%.
Some of the indigenous people of North America say that if you find yourself on a dead horse, get off it and get an alive one. But some of the Western responses seem to be to buy a stronger whip, to change the riders or threaten the horse with termination. Of course, needing to appoint a committee to study the horse and visit other countries to study their dead horses.
We do need to find a way of getting out there that we have a range of drugs that are being used in our country. They have a range of harms that could be put on a hierarchy of harms, and there's issues around how we might do that. And then they need to be treated in regulation in a way that addresses the health issues first, the justice issues second, and then dealing with any security issues third. And alcohol and tobacco must be included in that list of drugs. And that will help to, if we were able to do that, we could unpick this issue of illicit versus legal drugs.
If every citizen has the right to health care, what is it about alcohol and drug treatment that sort of makes it somehow distinctive and different? Because treatment and health care is not or should not be dependent on any activities or areas of a person's life. You know, a person should be entitled to alcohol and drug treatment just the same as they should be entitled to treatment if they fall and break their legs. But it is not the case. If we think about alcohol and drug treatment, and specifically for those who are involved with drugs that are illicit, the path to accessing that treatment is over broken glass.
Drug use is and always has been an element of human behaviour, and it will continue to be. We ought, of course, to try and manage or contain the market. We ought to try and limit as much as we can the problems that arise from drug use when it occurs. But the challenge we have is to have effective policies in place to minimise the harm that arises from use, to manage the problem, not to pretend that we are going to eradicate it.
We have to remember that a lot of controlled drugs are essential to medicine. And if I may show you a slide that dramatically illustrates the problem we have. There is no greater global health inequality than the inequality in access to medicines. Most of the world's people in severe pain do not have access to even the most basic opioid medications for their pain. Tens of millions of people every year, according to the WHO, are suffering from the pain of cancer without pain care, the pain of AIDS without pain care. This is horrific, and it is due to some degree to the difficulty, to a set of barriers that are related to our current drug control system. It's not a system that, it's again not something that requires changes in the instruments, but it requires a great deal of change in how we implement them if we want to get over this problem.
The stat was looking at actually arrest rates for marijuana, and Switzerland was twice the number of other countries. It reminded me, I saw a presentation from someone from Switzerland who talked about the enforcement policies they had in Switzerland on marijuana. And what happened is they reduced, had a real big focus from a police point of view, reduced the supply of marijuana, so the price went right up. And what they ended up dealing with was a reduced use of marijuana, but this huge increase in binge drinking and a whole lot of violence-related problems as a result from that.
How do we balance the harms that are imposed on people by our drug policies that are separate and apart from the harms associated with using drugs or being involved in drug-related crime? The issue of arrest, conviction, incarceration, post-conviction sanctions are very, very different depending upon what your race is, what your age is, and what your economic status is. And we don't really talk about that much. And you would think that if the goal was to have some justice and fairness, then the people that you should punish the most are the ones who are richest, the ones who have the most resources, the ones who theoretically have the less justification for breaking the law and misusing drugs. But no matter where you go in the world, that's not the case.
Prohibition has failed. This is an evident fact and an increasingly urgent one. We see this failure in communities decimated by incarceration and yet still vulnerable to terrible levels of drug-related harm. We see it in the booming drug business, hardly constrained at all by all our suppression efforts. We see it in the dramatic destabilizing role of drugs in nations like Mexico, or in its geopolitical force in the role of opium in the war in Afghanistan. Prohibition has failed, yet one may reasonably tremble at the prospect of abandoning it.
Sometimes you've got to go and look for the teachings and learnings of your elders. And the first speech by a Māori in the New Zealand Parliament in 1868 was by this man, Tariha Tamaranui. And he basically said, focus on that which is good. We live in a very ambiguous environment. We work in an ambiguous environment. People tell you all sorts of lies. They say one thing and do another. And you could get very despairing and lost and confused. So we just take this man's word, the first speech by a Māori in the New Zealand Parliament, focus on that which is good. When trouble arises, let's come together and deal to it, but don't get so consumed by your glasses of trouble that you can't see the good.